A wealthy businessman donated $350 to a homeless woman for her child's food. The following day, he encountered her at his late love's grave, who had passed away 23 years prior. Robert Thompson sat at a table in one of Manhattan's most upscale establishments, but the opulence surrounding him held no significance. Nothing could fill the void within. He gazed out the window, observing the rain cascading onto the streets, the droplets sliding down the glass like tears, reflecting the heaviness in his heart. The world outside was bleak and somber, perfectly mirroring his mood, perpetually rainy, dark, and isolated. This had been his reality for over 2 decades, ever since his wife Emma's tragic demise. Robert had been unable to move forward. Her loss had created a chasm that no amount of wealth or achievement could bridge. He had constructed a financial empire, yet his triumphs felt empty. He went through the motions, attending corporate meetings and extravagant dinners, but it was all merely a distraction from the anguish he carried with him every single day. Robert absently swirled the wine in his glass, watching the liquid rotate in circles. Business transactions, fancy meals, lavish events. It all seemed bland to him now. None of it held any importance. He exhaled deeply, the weight of the years pressing down on him. The reality was, despite all his success, Robert was utterly alone. He had no children, at least none that he was aware of. Emma had never wanted to broach the subject of kids before her passing, and Robert hadn't pushed her on it. Now he deeply regretted it. What he wouldn't give to have a part of her still alive, something of her to protect and cherish. Robert settled the bill and rose, slipping into his wool coat. The restaurant buzzed with conversations and laughter, but to him it was just noise, as distant as if it were happening in another realm. He stepped out onto the wet sidewalk where the rain continued to fall, cold and relentless. The city pulsed with life around him, but Robert felt nothing but the chill of the rain and the weight of his own solitude. The walk home took him past places that he and Emma used to frequent together. Every corner, every building, seemed tied to a memory of a time when life had seemed so much simpler, so much happier. But now all that remained were ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like most days, he would visit Emma's grave. Père Lachaise in Paris would have been the natural place for her to rest, but for reasons Robert never fully comprehended, she had chosen New York. Perhaps it was because the city represented the new life they'd begun together, a life that had been cut short too soon. As he walked along the rain-soaked sidewalk, something caught his attention. Under a shop's awning, a young woman sat huddled, clutching a baby in her arms. Her hair was damp from the rain, making her appear even more vulnerable. The sight stirred something deep within Robert. He paused, unsure of how to proceed. He wasn't accustomed to getting involved in situations like this. Over the years, he'd made countless contributions to charities, but he wasn't used to dealing with someone in need face to face. Yet there was something about this young woman that made him stop. Perhaps it was the way she held the baby so carefully, with a tenderness that reminded him of someone or something. Robert approached slowly, the rain dripping from his coat. "Here," he said, pulling out $350 in cash he'd just withdrawn from an ATM. He handed it to her. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, then filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you so much." For a moment, Robert felt something stir inside him, a connection to this stranger, as if their pain was somehow shared. He didn't say anything more, just nodded and walked away. But as he continued down the street, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. It was as if something had awakened inside him, something he hadn't realized was still there. When he finally got home, Robert was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He lay down in bed, the sound of the rain tapping against the window, his only companion. He closed his eyes, but the image of the woman and her baby kept replaying in his mind. Tomorrow, like always, he would visit Emma's grave. But little did he know that routine visit was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Robert followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his typical tailored suit, and prepared for his visit to Emma's grave. As he approached the familiar headstone, he suddenly stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know about Emma? The coincidence was too strange, too unsettling. He felt a wave of confusion and unease wash over him as he cautiously approached her. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice low and uncertain. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, trying to compose herself. "I didn't mean to intrude." Robert shook his head, his thoughts whirling. "No, it's not that. It's just, I saw you yesterday, under that shop awning. But how are you here? At this grave?" The woman's eyes widened with recognition. "Oh, it's you, the man who gave me the money." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I know this is hard to believe," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But it's the truth. My name is Sarah, and Emma was my mother." Robert's chest tightened as the reality of her words began to sink in. He looked at Sarah, and then at the baby in her arms, his mind racing with questions, but he didn't know where to begin. "How? Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would she keep this from me?" Sarah's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I don't know all the details, but I can imagine. Maybe she thought you weren't ready for the responsibility of a child, or perhaps she believed you were too focused on your business to be a father." "I don't know, Robert. I wish I did." Robert shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide." Sarah nodded. "Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought she was protecting you. Or maybe she was protecting herself. I don't have all the answers." Robert stood frozen, staring at Sarah, his mind still struggling to grasp what she had just revealed. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around the cemetery, but all he could hear was the pounding of his heart in his ears. The baby in Sarah's arms shifted, letting out a soft whimper, and that small sound seemed to snap him out of his daze. How is this possible?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible. His entire world had just been turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew about his life with Emma, about their relationship, was now in question. He had lived his life believing he knew everything there was to know about Emma, only to discover that there were chapters of her life he hadn't even read. "So you came here looking for answers?" Robert asked, his voice strained. Sarah nodded. "Yes, I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to know why she kept me a secret. And when I found out where she was buried, I knew I had to come." Robert's gaze fell to the headstone, his wife's name etched in cold, unforgiving stone. It had been his ritual, his connection to Emma, for all these years. Now standing here with Sarah, he felt like a stranger in his own grief. "I don't understand," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone?" Sarah's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I don't know the details, but I can imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child, or maybe she thought you were too focused on your business to be a father." "I don't know, Robert. I wish I did." Robert shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide." Sarah nodded. Maybe she was scared. Fear can make people do things they later regret. Robert stood there, his mind reeling. Sarah and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he hadn't been allowed to be part of. But they were here now, standing right in front of him. "I still don't understand," Robert finally said, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of anger fading into something softer. "Emma never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me?" Sarah's eyes flickered with empathy. "I don't know what her reasons were, Robert. I've asked myself the same question over and over. But I do know that she loved you. That much was clear from the little I've learned about her." Robert's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time. He could see traces of Emma in her features, the curve of her cheek, the shape of her eyes, and the baby, his grandson. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "You're my daughter," he said, his voice filled with wonder and pain. "And that makes Daniel my grandson." Sarah looked at him cautiously, unsure of where he was going with this. "I've spent my whole life building something," Robert continued, his voice soft but resolute. But none of it ever mattered, not really. After Emma died, I didn't have anything left. But now I'm realizing that maybe I still have a chance to fix that. Maybe I still have a chance to be something more than just a businessman. Sarah blinked, her face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. What are you saying, Robert? Robert took a deep breath, feeling as though he was standing on the edge of a precipice. I'm saying that I want to be part of your lives. If you'll let me, I know it won't be easy, and I know I have a lot to make up for, but I want to try. The weight of the moment hung between them, years of secrets and missed opportunities pressing down on both of them. But there was also a glimmer of hope, a chance for something new to grow from the ashes of the past. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but she managed a small smile. I'd like that, she said softly. I think Daniel would like that too. For the first time in years, Robert felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. He had spent so many years believing that his life had ended when Emma died, and that there was no way forward. But now, standing here with Sarah and Daniel, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for a new beginning. The revelation of Sarah's existence and the fact that he was a grandfather shook Robert to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. As much as he wanted to be angry and feel betrayed by Emma, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of responsibility he now felt. Sarah was his daughter, and Daniel was his grandson. He couldn't walk away from that. Back at his apartment, the rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows as Robert stood in the dimly lit room, staring out at the city. His thoughts returned to Emma, her laugh, the way she'd furrow her brow when she was concentrating on the warmth of her smile. He tried to recall their conversations, searching for any hint that might have suggested she was keeping such a monumental secret. He walked over to his desk, pulling out an old journal Emma had given him years ago. Likewise, he'd never written in it, but he'd kept it as a memento of her. He opened it, flipping through the blank pages as if they might hold some answers. To his surprise, tucked toward the back of the journal, he found it, an entry in Emma's handwriting. The entry was dated just a few months before Emma's death, and as Robert's eyes scanned the page, his heart began to race. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. How could I let this happen now after all these years? Emma had written, Robert would never understand. He'd never forgive me, but how can I keep living this lie? Robert sank into his chair, the weight of Emma's words crushing him. He'd always believed they'd shared everything, and that there were no secrets between them. Now he realized how wrong he'd been. Emma had carried this burden alone, afraid of his reaction and of losing him. He would never understand the choices Emma had made, but there was still a path forward. Sarah had come to him seeking answers, and now more than ever, Robert knew he couldn't turn his back on her. He had already lost too much time, and he wasn't about to lose any more. The next morning, Robert made a decision. He needed to reach out to Sarah. He had promised her he would try, and now more than ever, he wanted to keep that promise. Furthermore, he called her, his heart racing as the phone rang. When she answered, her voice was hesitant but hopeful. They agreed to meet at a small cafe near the park. When Robert arrived, he saw Sarah already seated at a table and Daniel sleeping peacefully in a stroller beside her. As he approached, he could see the tension in her movements, like she wasn't sure how this was going to go. Hi, she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. She shifted Daniel in her arms, trying to make him comfortable before looking at Robert again. Thanks for meeting me. Robert nodded, his throat tightening with nerves. Of course, he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. He glanced down at Daniel, who was looking up at him with wide eyes, curious but quiet. How is he? Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. He's good, a bit fussy, but nothing unusual. Robert took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Sarah, I want you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, about Emma, about you, about everything. Sarah nodded, her expression guarded but open. So have I. It's a lot to process, isn't it? Yes, it is, Robert agreed. But I want you to know that I don't blame you for any of this. And I don't think Emma didn't want you. I can see now that she was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to handle everything. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you. I think she was just lost. Sarah let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. I guess I always imagined that if I found out why she gave me up, it would give me some kind of closure. But now it just feels complicated. Robert nodded. I know it's not easy, but the one thing I've learned is that you can't change the past. You can only decide how to move forward. You're right, Sarah said softly, a hint of a smile on her lips. Robert's heart swelled. I'd like to change that, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she wiped it away quickly. I think Daniel would like that too. For the first time, Robert felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. He had spent so many years believing that his life had ended when Emma died, and that there was no way forward. But now, sitting here with Sarah and Daniel, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Robert and Sarah began the slow, sometimes awkward process of getting to know each other. They met for coffee, went for walks in the park, and spent time together at Robert's apartment. Each interaction was a delicate dance of caution and hope as they navigated the complexities of their newfound relationship. One evening, after a particularly long day, Robert sat in his living room nursing a glass of whiskey. He hadn't seen Sarah for a few days, and while he wanted to reach out to her, he was also trying to respect her boundaries. It was such a delicate balance that he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. He knew that pushing too hard might drive her away, but not pushing hard enough felt like he was letting the opportunity slip away again. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Sarah. Hey, are you free tomorrow afternoon? I thought we could take Daniel to the park if you're up for it. Robert felt a surge of warmth in his chest. Absolutely, he typed back. I'd love to. The next day, as they walked through the park, Daniel babbling happily in his stroller, Robert felt a sense of peace that had been absent from his life for so long. They reached a bench near the lake, and Sarah gestured for Robert to sit. She unbuckled Daniel from the stroller and set him on her lap, smiling as he squirmed excitedly at the sight of the ducks swimming by. It's hard to believe how much he's grown already, Robert said, watching Daniel with a smile. Yeah, it feels like just yesterday he was a tiny baby, Sarah replied, her voice soft with affection. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Daniel's wide-eyed wonder at the world around him. Sarah, Robert said finally, his voice gentle, I know we can't change what happened in the past. We can't undo the years we lost, but I want you to know that I'm committed to being here now, to being part of your lives if you'll let me. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I'd like that, she said. I think we both need that. Robert nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. I know it won't be easy. We're still getting to know each other, and there's so much to figure out. But I want to try. I want to be the father you deserved all along. And the grandfather Daniel deserves, Sarah added with a small smile. Yes, Robert agreed, his heart feeling fuller than it had in years. I want to focus on what we have now, on being there for you and Daniel. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. That means a lot to me, Robert. I know this hasn't been easy for any of us, but I think you're right. We can't change the past, but we can move forward. Robert felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared. He knew it would always be there, lingering beneath the surface. But it no longer felt like a burden he couldn't carry. He had found something else, something worth living for again. As the weeks turned into months, Robert, Sarah, and Daniel slowly began to form a new kind of family. It wasn't always easy. Misunderstandings, awkward moments, and the weight of the past often threatened to overwhelm them, but they persevered, learning to communicate, trust, and lean on each other. Robert embraced his role as a father and grandfather with a passion that surprised even him. He and Sarah filled in gaps from their past, sharing stories and slowly building a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. They discovered shared interests, laughing over similarities they never knew they had. Challenges arose. Sarah sometimes struggled with feelings of abandonment, while Robert wrestled with guilt. But they faced these challenges together, finding strength in shared experiences. Robert also grew closer to Daniel, cherishing their time together, whether at the park or reading stories. A new joy filled him. one he hadn't realized he was capable of feeling. Through it all, Robert learned to release the anger and bitterness that had consumed him. He came to understand that while Emma's decision had caused him pain, it had also, in a way, given him a second chance at happiness. One day at the park, Sarah turned to Robert with a thoughtful expression. "I used to wonder why Mom didn't tell you about me," she said softly, "but I found something that might explain it." Robert's breath caught. "What did you find?" Sarah hesitated before pulling out a folded letter. "It's from Mom to her best friend. I think you should read it." With trembling hands, Robert read Emma's words, a mix of emotions washing over him. Sadness, understanding, and bittersweet closure. "My dearest friend, I know you've always told me to be honest with Robert, but I'm afraid. He's always said he isn't ready for children, and I don't want to force him into a role he's not prepared for. I don't want him to resent me or our child, so I've made a decision. I hope he'll understand." Robert looked up at Sarah. "She thought she was protecting me," he said softly. "She was scared, Robert. She didn't want to lose you." Robert nodded, the weight of this revelation sinking in. He realized Emma had lived with more fears than he had ever known. As he sat watching Daniel play, Robert felt both sadness for the lost years and gratitude for the second chance. He mourned the life they could have had, but he was thankful for the opportunity to know his daughter and grandson. Late one night, Robert reflected on the twists and turns of his life. He thought of Emma's secret, his newly discovered daughter, and the grandson who reignited his hope. Though he wanted to jump into his new role, Robert knew healing and trust would take time. But for the first time in years, Robert felt hope, real, tangible hope for the future. Sitting by the window, he made a silent promise to Emma, Sarah, Daniel, and himself. He would embrace this second chance with everything he had. He would be the father and grandfather Emma believed he could be. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but now Robert had something to live for. A family, a future, and the chance to make things right.